The November evening air carried the familiar scent of mesquite and dust that had defined Amarillo, Texas, for generations. George Strait adjusted his black cowboy hat as he pulled his modest pickup truck into the gravel parking lot of the Dusty Boots Tavern, the headlights sweeping across a collection of vehicles that told the story of a different generation. Sleek sedans, modified trucks with oversized wheels, and motorcycles that gleamed under the security lights like metallic predators. At 71, certain realities of aging had become unavoidable companions on his journeys across the Lone Star State. The 3-hour drive from his old friend Bobby Henderson's ranch had been filled with memories and laughter, stories of their youth when they'd both dreamed of making it big in Nashville, back when the world seemed full of endless possibilities and their knees didn't ache when the weather changed. Bobby had shown him around the property they'd purchased together as young men back in 1975, when George was still playing honky-tonks and military bases, scraping together enough money to buy gas for the next gig. They'd walked the fence lines where they used to practice guitar, where Bobby would critique George's songwriting and George would help Bobby with his harmony vocals. Those dreams had taken different paths. George's leading to stages across the world, Bobby's leading to a successful cattle operation and a family that filled his house with the kind of joy that no amount of fame could replicate. Now, 3 hours into his drive back to San Antonio, nature was making its urgent demands known with the persistence that had become more frequent and less forgiving with each passing year. He hadn't planned to stop here, had actually driven past several more welcoming establishments, but the pressure in his bladder was becoming impossible to ignore, and the Dusty Boots Tavern was the next lit building on this stretch of highway. The establishment stood like a defiant statement against everything that made Texas famous. Its neon signs advertised craft beer and live rock music, while posters of alternative bands covered every available inch of the weathered wooden exterior. A large banner proclaimed, "No country, no crying, no compromise," which struck George as oddly specific for a bar in the heart of Texas. He'd heard about places like this, establishments that seemed to exist solely to reject the musical heritage that had put the Lone Star State on the cultural map. The parking lot told its own story. Among the newer vehicles sat a few older trucks, their owners likely locals who had been coming here since before the management decided to wage war against their own cultural roots. George noticed beer cans scattered around the dumpster, cigarette butts forming small colonies near the entrance, and the kind of casual disregard for cleanliness that suggested either very young management or owners who had given up caring about first impressions. As he stepped out of his truck, his weathered boots crunched against the gravel, mixed with broken glass from bottles that had met unfortunate ends. The sounds of electric guitars and heavy drums poured from the building like an auditory assault, accompanied by laughter and conversation from a crowd that sounded decidedly younger than his usual audience. The bass line was so aggressive, it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, making his truck's windows rattle in sympathy. George straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache that came with decades of performing, countless hours in tour buses, and the accumulated wear of a life lived fully. His reflection in his truck's window showed a man who had aged well but couldn't hide the passage of time. Silver hair beneath the black hat, lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into stage lights and Texas sunsets, hands that showed the calluses of both guitar playing and ranch work. The walk to the entrance felt longer than it should have, partly due to his physical discomfort and partly due to a growing sense that he was about to enter hostile territory. The bouncer at the door was a young man with arms covered in tattoos and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He looked George up and down with the kind of casual dismissal reserved for people deemed immediately unworthy of attention. "Cover charge is $15, the bouncer said without looking up from his phone, his voice carrying the boredom of someone who had repeated the same phrase hundreds of times that evening. George reached for his wallet, but the bouncer continued. "Though I'm not sure this is really your kind of place, sir. There's a Cracker Barrel about 10 miles down the highway if you're looking for somewhere more appropriate." The suggestion carried just enough condescension to sting, but George had learned long ago to pick his battles carefully. He handed over a $20 bill and said simply, "I just need to use the restroom, son." The bouncer pocketed the money without offering change and stepped aside with a shrug that seemed to say, "Your funeral." George pushed through the heavy wooden doors and was immediately hit by a wall of sensory overload that felt like stepping into an alien world. The interior hit him like a wall of contradictions. Where most Texas bars honored their heritage with wood paneling, vintage photographs of local legends, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that spoke to generations of tradition, the Dusty Boots had embraced a modern aesthetic that seemed almost aggressively anti-traditional. Edison bulbs hung from industrial fixtures that looked like they belonged in a Brooklyn warehouse. Exposed brick walls displayed graffiti-style artwork that celebrated everything except the culture that surrounded them, and not a single piece of country music memorabilia was visible anywhere. The crowd was exactly what he'd expected. Mostly people in their 20s and early 30s, dressed in the kind of carefully curated casual wear that cost more than his first guitar. They moved with the confident energy of people who had never been told they couldn't have something they wanted, who had never faced real rejection or failure. Their conversations were loud and animated, filled with references to bands he'd never heard of and cultural touchstones that belonged to a world he didn't fully understand. Behind the bar, a young man with carefully styled hair and multiple ear piercings was mixing drinks with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested he'd learned his craft from YouTube videos rather than experience. His movements were precise but showy, designed more to impress than to efficiently serve customers. This was Dylan Carter, though George had no way of knowing that the 19-year-old came from one of Amarillo's wealthiest families, that his father owned 3 successful car dealerships and his mother sat on the boards of half the charitable organizations in town. Dylan worked at the Dusty Boots, not because he needed the money, but because it represented everything his parents disapproved of: the music, the atmosphere, the casual rejection of the values they'd tried to instill in him. It was rebellion with a paycheck, a way to thumb his nose at expectations, while still cashing checks that would supplement his already generous allowance. He'd discovered the anti-country music stance of the bar and embraced it enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to reject not just his parents' musical preferences, but everything they represented: tradition, respect for elders, the slower pace of life that had defined their generation. To Dylan, country music wasn't just outdated, it was a symbol of everything he considered backwards about Texas culture. The bartender looked up as George approached, his expression shifting from casual indifference to poorly concealed disdain. Everything about the older man seemed to represent what Dylan had spent his teenage years rejecting: the conservative values, the traditional appearance, the measured pace that he associated with his parents' generation and their friends who still thought the world owed them respect, simply because they'd managed to survive longer than everyone else. Dylan had been having a good night up until this point. The crowd was young and appreciative. His tips were above average, and he'd been entertaining them with stories about the weird old people who occasionally wandered into the bar by mistake. The arrival of this particular specimen seemed like a gift from the comedy gods. "We don't really do the whole cowboy thing here," Dylan said before George could speak, his voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that comes from youth combined with privilege. His tone was loud enough to carry to nearby tables, and several patrons turned to see what was happening. "This isn't that kind of place." The comment drew a few chuckles from customers who were already predisposed to find humor in the generational clash unfolding at the bar. Dylan basked in the attention, feeling the familiar rush that came from being the center of social activity. George removed his hat politely, revealing silver hair that caught the Edison bulb lighting and seemed to glow with its own quiet dignity. The gesture was automatic, bred from decades of being raised to show respect in other people's establishments, regardless of how he was being treated in return. "I'm sorry to bother you, son," George said, his voice carrying the quiet courtesy that had been drummed into him by parents who believed that good manners were non-negotiable, regardless of circumstances. "I was just wondering if I could use your restroom. I've got a bit of a drive ahead of me." The simplicity and politeness of the request seemed to amuse Dylan even more. Here was this old man, dressed like he'd stepped out of a 1980s music video, being respectful and apologetic when Dylan had already made it clear he wasn't welcome. The contrast between George's dignity and Dylan's hostility was stark, but Dylan was too caught up in his performance to recognize it. "The bathroom's for customers only," Dylan announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to ensure others could hear. Several more patrons turned their attention to the interaction, sensing entertainment in the making. House policy. The policy wasn't actually written anywhere and was applied selectively, depending on Dylan's mood and the appearance of the person asking. Well-dressed young customers were never challenged. Older patrons, especially those who looked like they might be country music fans, were often subjected to various forms of bureaucratic harassment. "Of course," George replied, reaching for his wallet with the patient understanding of someone who had learned not to expect special treatment. "I'd be happy to buy something, maybe just a coffee if you have it." Dylan's laugh was sharp and theatrical, performed as much for his audience as for its target. "Coffee? Dude, this isn't Denny's. We serve real drinks here." He gestured expansively at the impressive array of craft beers and premium liquors behind him, each bottle carefully selected to appeal to customers who valued appearance and price point over actual quality. "But I guess at your age you probably shouldn't be drinking anyway, right? Medication interactions and all that." The comment drew more laughter from the crowd, and Dylan felt the familiar intoxication that came from successfully entertaining an audience. He'd discovered early in his employment that mocking older customers was a reliable way to bond with the younger patrons, who seemed to enjoy watching their parents' generation being taken down a peg. George absorbed the comment without visible reaction, though internally he was cataloging the young man's behavior and trying to understand what had shaped someone so young into someone so casually cruel. At Dylan's age, George had been playing military bases and honky-tonks, learning hard lessons about respect and humility from audiences who wouldn't tolerate pretension or disrespect. "A water would be fine then," George said simply, maintaining his composure despite the growing discomfort of his physical needs and the emotional weight of being systematically humiliated in public. "Water?" Dylan repeated, as if the word itself was amusing. He turned to his audience and rolled his eyes dramatically. "Let me guess, tap water? Because that's about all we can trust someone your age to handle without spilling all over themselves." B. The comment was mean-spirited enough that some of the laughter became more scattered. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, beginning to recognize that what had started as harmless generational teasing was crossing into genuine cruelty. But Dylan, intoxicated by the attention and his own cleverness, was incapable of reading the room or recognizing when he'd gone too far. Near the back of the bar, Jennifer Walsh, a 32-year-old emergency room nurse who had come in with friends after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift, watched the interaction with growing disgust. She'd grown up listening to her grandfather's record collection, which had been heavy on classic country music, and something about the older man's bearing and dignity reminded her powerfully of the man who had helped raise her after her father died in a car accident when she was 8. At a corner table, Michael Rodriguez, a 45-year-old construction foreman who had stopped in for a beer after a long day pouring concrete, was fighting the urge to intervene. He'd been raised in a household where respect for elders was automatic and non-negotiable, where treating someone's grandfather the way this kid was behaving would have earned him a backhand across the mouth and a lecture he'd never forget. But George seemed to be handling the situation with remarkable patience, so both Jennifer and Michael held their positions, though both were preparing to step in if things escalated further. "Son, I just need to use the facilities," George said, his voice remaining calm despite the growing chorus of snickers from Dylan's audience. "I'm happy to pay whatever you think is fair." The continued politeness in the face of systematic rudeness seemed to frustrate Dylan. He'd expected the old man to get angry, to storm out, to give him some kind of dramatic reaction that would provide the climax to his performance. Instead, George's quiet dignity was making Dylan's cruelty look petty and unnecessary. Dylan leaned against the bar, clearly enjoying his audience and the power he held over someone who needed something from him. "You know what the problem is with guys like you?" he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to a slower student. "You think you can just walk into any place and expect people to accommodate you. This is 2023, not 1953. We don't owe you anything, just because you're old." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a snuffed candle. Several patrons who had been enjoying the show suddenly found themselves looking away, uncomfortable with the naked ageism being displayed. George felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the sharp sting of public humiliation based purely on his age and appearance. But more than personal hurt, George felt a deep disappointment in what his beloved Texas was becoming, at least in pockets like this. He'd spent his entire career celebrating the values that made his home state special: respect, hospitality, the belief that everyone deserved basic human dignity regardless of their circumstances. To see those values so casually dismissed by someone young enough to be his grandson was more painful than any personal insult could be. "I understand," George said quietly, placing a $20 bill on the bar with the careful precision of someone who had learned to maintain dignity even in the face of systematic disrespect. "Maybe this will cover whatever the house minimum is." Dylan looked at the money with exaggerated surprise, as if George had just offered to pay with Confederate currency. $20? Wow, big spender. "You sure your Social Security check can cover that?" The laughter from the crowd grew louder, though it was becoming more uncomfortable, more forced. Dylan basked in it like a performer who'd found his rhythm and was determined to milk it for everything it was worth. The assumption that George was living on Social Security, that he was financially vulnerable and therefore fair game for mockery, added another layer of cruelty to the interaction. Dylan had no way of knowing that he was talking to someone whose net worth was measured in tens of millions, someone who had donated more money to charity than Dylan's family had earned in their entire lives. George reached for the money, preparing to leave and find another establishment where basic human decency might still exist. But Dylan wasn't finished with his performance. "Actually, you know what?" Dylan announced, his voice carrying across the room like a carnival barker's pitch. "I'll make you a deal, old-timer. You want to use our bathroom so bad? How about you tell us all what you're famous for first? I mean, you've got the whole cowboy costume going on, hat, boots, the works. So what's your claim to fame? Did you used to wrangle cattle, ride in some rodeo back in the day? Or are you just another old guy trying to recapture his youth by dressing up like something he never actually was?" The suggestion that his appearance was a costume struck George harder than he'd expected. These weren't just clothes to him. They represented who he was, who he'd always been, long before fame had ever found him. The boots were worn from decades of ranch work and stage performances. The hat had shaded his eyes during countless outdoor concerts and cattle drives on his own property. Every piece of his attire told a story of authenticity that this young man couldn't begin to understand. "I'm not famous," George said simply, though the words felt strange in his mouth. In the context of this room, among these people who clearly had no knowledge of country music history, the statement was technically accurate. Fame, he had learned, was contextual and temporary. In this moment, in this place, he was just an old man who needed to use the restroom. "Just a man," Dylan repeated mockingly, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Right. Well, just a man. Our bathroom has a policy about people who might, have accidents. At your age, I'm guessing that's a real concern, isn't it? Maybe you should have worn the adult diapers tonight." The comment crossed a line that even Dylan's most enthusiastic supporters recognized as too far. The laughter died almost completely, replaced by uncomfortable silence and the sound of people suddenly finding their drinks very interesting. Jennifer Walsh actually winced, imagining how she would feel if someone talked to her grandfather that way. Michael Rodriguez's hands clenched into fists under his table. But Dylan, drunk on his own performance and unable to recognize that he'd lost his audience, pressed on with the relentless momentum of someone who didn't know when to stop. "Tell you what, though," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking sweetness that made the cruelty even more pronounced. "I'm feeling generous tonight. You can use the bathroom. But first, you have to admit that country music is garbage and that people your age should stay home instead of bothering the rest of us who are trying to have a good time." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge to everything George had spent his life building and defending. Dylan was demanding that he renounce not just his own career, but the entire musical tradition that had shaped American culture for generations. It was a demand for complete capitulation, for the systematic destruction of his own dignity. George stood perfectly still, his hat in his hands, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something larger, something that had been building for years. The dismissal of experience, the mockery of tradition, the assumption that age automatically meant irrelevance. It was about the systematic dismantling of the values that had built the very state they were standing in. But as he stood there, facing a level of disrespect he'd rarely encountered, even in his youngest days, struggling to make it in the music business, George Strait began to formulate a response that none of them would ever forget. The challenge had been issued, the gauntlet thrown down in front of an audience that expected to see an old man's dignity finally crumble. They had no idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. Behind the bar, Tommy Patterson, a 60-year-old part-time bartender who had been quietly washing glasses during Dylan's performance, stopped what he was doing. Something about the stranger's posture, his quiet dignity under fire, was triggering a memory that he couldn't quite place. Tommy had lived through the golden age of country music, had seen every major star perform at one time or another, and something about this moment felt significant in a way he couldn't yet articulate. The stage was set for something that would transform this story from a simple tale of generational conflict into something approaching legend. George Strait, the king of country music, was about to remind everyone present what it meant to respond to cruelty with grace and ignorance with education. The question was, would Dylan Carter recognize what was happening before it was too late to salvage any dignity from the situation he'd created? The silence that followed Dylan's ultimatum stretched like a taut guitar string, ready to snap. George Strait stood at the bar, $20 bill still in his weathered hand, while Dylan Carter basked in what he believed was his moment of triumph. The young man had no idea he was staring across the bar at someone who had sold more than 70 million albums worldwide, who had been inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, who had earned the love and respect of millions of people across multiple generations. All Dylan saw was an elderly man in a cowboy hat, someone who represented everything he'd spent his privileged teenage years rebelling against in his comfortable suburban bubble, where consequences were rare and respect was considered optional. The crowd had grown during the confrontation, drawn by the spectacle of conflict like moths to a flame. Even patrons from the back room had wandered over to see what was happening, creating a semicircle of onlookers who expected to witness the final humiliation of someone they'd already dismissed as irrelevant. "Come on, old man," Dylan pressed, his voice carrying across the tavern like a challenge thrown down in the town square. "It's a simple request. Just say country music is garbage and that you should be home watching Matlock reruns instead of bothering real people who are trying to enjoy their evening." The demand had evolved beyond simple cruelty into something more systematic. An attempt to force George to renounce not just his presence in their space, but his entire identity, his life's work, and the cultural tradition he'd spent decades helping to define and preserve. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, finally recognizing that what had started as generational teasing had crossed into something uglier. Among them was Jennifer Walsh, who had moved closer to the bar, still hoping somehow this situation could end without the older man being further degraded. There was something about his quiet dignity under assault that reminded her powerfully of her late grandfather, a man who had taught her that character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how one handled injustice and cruelty. At a corner table, Michael Rodriguez watched with growing disgust, his construction worker's hands clenched around his beer bottle. At 45, he was old enough to remember when respect for elders was automatic, when treating someone's grandfather this way would have resulted in immediate intervention from every decent person in the room. The fact that most of the crowd was either enjoying the show or studiously ignoring it spoke to a cultural shift that made him physically sick. Near the pool tables, a group of college students had gathered, some filming the interaction with their phones, though not for the malicious purposes that would come later in the evening. They were documenting what they saw as an amusing example of generational conflict, not yet understanding they were about to witness something that would change their perspective on respect, dignity, and the true meaning of character. But Dylan was just getting started, intoxicated by the attention and his own sense of power over someone who needed something from him. He'd discovered that humiliating older customers was a reliable way to bond with the younger patrons who seemed to enjoy watching their parents' generation taken down a peg or two. "You know what I think?" Dylan announced to his audience, his voice growing louder with confidence and cruelty. "I think guys like you are what's wrong with Texas. All hat and no cattle, as they say. Pretending to be something you're not because you watched too many westerns growing up and decided to play dress up." The irony was staggering in its completeness. Here was a young man from suburban privilege, someone who had never worked a day on a ranch or struggled for anything meaningful in his life, accusing a man who had literally grown up on a cattle ranch of playing cowboy dress up. George felt each word like a physical blow, not because of their personal cruelty, but because of what they represented. The systematic dismantling of values and traditions that had shaped not just his life, but the character of the state he loved. This wasn't just about music or fashion. It was about the rejection of everything that had made Texas special. The work ethic, the respect for tradition, the belief that experience and wisdom had value. "Son," George said, his voice so quiet that people had to lean in to hear him, "I've never pretended to be anything I'm not." The simple statement carried more weight than Dylan could possibly understand. George had spent his entire career being exactly who he was, A cowboy who happened to be able to sing, a ranch kid from Poteet who had never forgotten where he came from, someone who wore his heritage not as a costume, but as the authentic expression of his identity. Dylan's laugh was harsh and performative, designed to entertain his audience rather than express genuine amusement. Right, so what are you then? What's your big contribution to society? Let me guess, you probably tell people you used to be somebody important, right? Maybe claim you were in a band or something. The guess was so accidentally accurate that Tommy Patterson, who had been quietly observing from behind the bar, nearly dropped the glass he was drying. Something about this entire interaction was nagging at him, like a half-remembered melody that stayed just beyond recognition. "I've been blessed to make a living playing music," George replied, still maintaining his composure despite the growing discomfort of his physical needs and the emotional weight of being systematically torn down in public. This admission seemed to delight Dylan beyond measure. A musician! Oh, this is perfect! He turned to his audience with the theatrical flourish of someone who had just discovered gold. "Let me guess, you played in some sad little country band at VFW halls and wedding receptions, right? Probably convinced yourself you were going to make it big someday, but reality never quite caught up to the dream." The assessment was so wrong, so completely inverted from the truth, that George almost smiled despite the circumstances. He had indeed played VFW halls and wedding receptions, but that had been at the very beginning of a career that had taken him to sold-out arenas around the world. Behind the bar, Tommy Patterson had stopped pretending to work and was now openly staring at George. Something about the stranger's voice, his bearing, his quiet dignity under fire, was triggering memories of old concerts, vintage music videos, and countless hours of radio play from his youth. The nagging feeling that he should recognize this man was growing stronger with each passing moment. "Actually," Dylan continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was delivering comedy gold, "I bet you're one of those guys who thinks country music is real music, that it means something profound about the human experience." His voice took on a mocking, exaggerated drawl. "All those deep, meaningful songs about trucks, dogs, and failed relationships. Newsflash, Grandpa. It's just repetitive garbage for people who peaked in high school and never got over it." The description of country music as repetitive garbage hit George with particular force. He had spent his entire career trying to elevate the genre, to write and perform songs that spoke to universal human experiences, love, loss, hope, heartbreak, in ways that resonated across cultural and economic boundaries. To hear his life's work dismissed so casually by someone who had clearly never listened to a country song long enough to understand its depth was both infuriating and heartbreaking. "You want to know what real music is?" Dylan gestured toward the speakers, which were currently playing some forgettable electronic dance mix that sounded like it had been assembled by a computer algorithm designed to eliminate any trace of human emotion or authentic experience. "It's music that evolves, that pushes boundaries, that doesn't rely on tired cliches about the good old days that weren't actually that good." The crowd's laughter had become more scattered and uncomfortable as Dylan's performance grew more vicious. What had started as amusing to some was beginning to feel unnecessarily cruel, even to people who had no particular fondness for country music or older people in general. Jennifer Walsh found herself hoping that the older man would simply give up and leave. This whole situation had gone far beyond harmless fun and had entered territory that made her ashamed to be in the same room. She kept thinking about her grandfather, who had taught her to play guitar on an old acoustic that had belonged to his father, who had filled her childhood with stories about the power of music to bring people together rather than tear them apart. Michael Rodriguez was thinking along similar lines, but his thoughts were darker and more immediate. He'd already decided that if this went much further, he was going to have words with the smart-mouthed kid behind the bar, regardless of the consequences. His own father had raised him to believe that protecting the dignity of elders wasn't optional. It was a fundamental responsibility of decent people. George absorbed each insult with the patience of someone who had learned over decades in the public eye that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to endure with dignity while your character was being revealed through contrast with your tormentors. But he was also calculating something else, not revenge, but rather how to respond in a way that might actually teach rather than simply retaliate. "Tell you what," Dylan said, his voice taking on a tone of mock generosity that made his cruelty even more pronounced. "Since you claim to be a musician, why don't you prove it? There's an old guitar over there in the corner gathering dust. Why don't you play us a song? Show us what real country music sounds like to someone who actually thinks it has value." He gestured toward a battered acoustic guitar that sat forgotten near what had once been a small performance area, but was now used primarily for storage. The instrument looked like it hadn't been touched in months, possibly years, its strings probably corroded, and its tuning questionable at best. "If you can actually play something, and I mean really play, not just strum 3 chords like every other wannabe cowboy, then maybe I'll let you use the bathroom. But if you can't, then you admit I'm right about everything, pay for everyone's next round, and get out of here with whatever dignity you have left." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke after a duel. Dylan had intended it as the ultimate humiliation, forcing an old man to prove himself with a musical instrument in front of a crowd that was clearly hostile to everything he represented. What he didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his young, privileged life. He was challenging someone who had mastered that particular instrument before Dylan was even born. Someone who had used an acoustic guitar to create some of the most beloved songs in American music history. The forgotten guitar in the corner wasn't just a prop or a decoration. It was about to become the instrument of Dylan's education. George looked at the instrument, then back at Dylan, his expression unreadable. "And if I play something you consider adequate, you'll allow me to use the restroom? If you can actually play," Dylan said with a smirk that was about to be permanently erased, "and not just fumble around like most people your age do with anything that requires coordination or skill." The ageism in the comment was so blatant that even some of Dylan's most enthusiastic supporters winced. The assumption that age automatically meant incompetence was not just cruel, but demonstrably false, though Dylan was about to learn that lesson in the most memorable way possible. But George Strait had made his decision. He was about to demonstrate something that Dylan couldn't possibly understand. That true mastery doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. That experience isn't a liability, it's an asset. That respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn through the demonstration of character under pressure. "All right, son," George said, placing his hat carefully on the bar and walking toward the forgotten guitar with the measured pace of someone who had walked onto countless stages in front of countless audiences, but had never faced a more important performance than the one he was about to give. As he picked up the instrument, Tommy Patterson suddenly went very still behind the bar. The way the stranger held the guitar, the natural ease with which his fingers found the frets, the unconscious professionalism of his posture. Tommy had seen that exact stance before in old concert footage and music videos that had defined his youth. The realization hit him like lightning. He knew exactly who was about to play that guitar. And Dylan Carter was about to learn a lesson he would never, ever forget. The transformation was about to begin. George Strait lifted the old acoustic guitar from its dusty resting place with the reverence of someone who understood that every instrument had a story to tell, regardless of its current condition. The guitar had seen better days. Its finish was worn, showing the ghost impressions of stickers that had been peeled away, and its strings looked like they hadn't been changed in months. But as he ran his fingers along the neck, testing the action and checking the tuning, he could feel its potential waiting to be awakened. The weight of the instrument in his hands was familiar and comforting, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. He had picked up his first guitar at the age of 13, a cheap acoustic his father had bought from a pawn shop, and had been making music with variations of this same basic design for nearly 60 years. The calluses on his fingertips, built up from decades of practice and performance, automatically found their positions on the strings. Dylan Carter leaned back against the bar, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed he was about to witness the final humiliation of his victim. The crowd had grown even larger, drawn by the prospect of seeing an old man embarrass himself in front of people young enough to be his grandchildren. Even patrons who had been playing pool or absorbed in their own conversations had moved closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "This should be good," Dylan announced to his audience, his voice dripping with anticipation. "Let's see what passes for music in the geriatric ward. Maybe he'll play us Old MacDonald Had a Farm, or something equally sophisticated." The crowd chuckled, but the laughter was becoming more nervous than genuinely amused. Several people were beginning to feel uncomfortable with the level of cruelty being displayed, though none had yet found the courage to intervene. Behind the bar, Tommy Patterson felt his heart racing as certainty crystallized in his mind. He was now absolutely convinced he knew who was holding that guitar, but the implications were so extraordinary that he found himself doubting his own eyes. Could it really be possible that George Strait, the king of country music himself, was standing in this hostile little bar, about to be humiliated by a teenager who had no idea who he was talking to? The answer was about to become unmistakably clear. Jennifer Walsh had moved closer, positioning herself where she could intervene, if necessary. There was something about the older man's quiet confidence as he handled the guitar that suggested he might not be the easy target Dylan expected. She'd grown up around musicians. Her grandfather had played in a bluegrass band, and she'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that separated real players from pretenders. Michael Rodriguez was thinking along similar lines, but his thoughts were focused more on Dylan than on George. The kid had painted himself into a corner with his public challenge, and Michael had a feeling that the consequences were going to be more severe than anyone expected. George settled onto a bar stool that someone had hastily provided, positioning the guitar comfortably against his body. The movement was so natural, so practiced, that several people in the crowd took notice. This wasn't someone who was nervous about performing. This was someone who was completely at home with a guitar in his hands. The tuning process alone should have been a warning to anyone who knew anything about music. George's fingers moved across the tuning pegs with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, making micro-adjustments that brought each string into perfect harmony with its neighbors. He wasn't guessing or struggling. He was working with the confidence of a master craftsman preparing his tools. "Any requests?" George asked mildly, his fingers already beginning to find familiar positions on the fretboard, testing chord progressions and checking the guitar's responsiveness. Dylan's laugh was harsh and theatrical, performed as much for his audience as for its target. "Oh, I don't know. How about something original? I mean, if you're such a musician, surely you've written your own songs, right? Not just learned to play other people's hits at some community center guitar classes." The irony was staggering in its completeness. Here was a man who had written or co-written dozens of songs that had become part of American culture, being challenged to prove he could create original music. Songs like "All My Exes Live in Texas," "Check Yes or No," and "I Cross My Heart" had become so embedded in the national consciousness that people sang them without even thinking about who had created them. "I might know an original song or two," George replied, his voice carrying just a hint of something that made Tommy Patterson lean forward intently behind the bar. George's fingers began to move across the strings, testing the guitar's voice, coaxing sound from its neglected body. The first few notes were exploratory, gentle, just a musician getting acquainted with his instrument. But even those tentative sounds carried something that made the room gradually grow quiet. There was a quality to the way he touched the strings, a precision and sensitivity that suggested decades of experience. His left hand formed chords with the unconscious ease of someone for whom the guitar had become an extension of his own body, while his right hand found picking patterns that brought out the instrument's natural resonance. Tommy Patterson's hands were shaking as he set down the glass he'd been drying. He recognized those finger positions, that particular style of playing. He'd seen it in countless concert videos, heard it on radio stations across Texas for more than 4 decades. Then, without fanfare or announcement, George Strait began to play Amarillo Morning. The opening melody flowed from the old guitar like water finding its natural course, each note placed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where it belonged because he had put it there originally. The song had been written about this very area of Texas, about the beauty of the high plains and the feeling of coming home. And hearing it played here, in this context, created an almost mystical connection between performer, song, and place. But this wasn't just someone playing a familiar song. This was the song being channeled through the man who had made it immortal. Every note carried the weight of authenticity. Every chord change reflected the original creative vision that had brought the song into existence. Dylan's smirk began to fade as the quality of the playing became undeniable. This wasn't some amateur fumbling through chord changes or struggling to keep tempo. This was master-level musicianship, the kind that comes only from decades of professional experience and natural talent refined through constant practice. The room was growing quieter with each measure, conversations stopping mid-sentence as people began to recognize that something extraordinary was happening. Even patrons who had no particular interest in country music could recognize the difference between competent playing and true artistry. When George began to sing, the transformation in the room was immediate and total. Amarillo morning up ahead, blue skies of heaven and sun to spread on. The voice that emerged was unmistakable, weathered by time and experience, but still carrying that distinctive tone that had defined country music for generations. It was a voice that had sold more records than any country artist in history, a voice that had soundtracked countless first dances, long drives across Texas highways, and quiet moments of reflection for millions of people. The sound hit the room like a physical force, causing several people to gasp audibly. Jennifer Walsh felt her knees go weak as recognition dawned. She knew this voice, had grown up with it playing in her childhood home, had danced to it at her cousin's wedding just 2 years earlier. Michael Rodriguez stood frozen, his beer bottle forgotten in his hand, his mind struggling to process what his ears were telling him. This couldn't be happening. George Strait couldn't be sitting in some dive bar in Amarillo, being humiliated by a teenage bartender who had no idea who he was. But it was happening. As George continued singing, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each line, the hostile atmosphere in the Dusty Boots Tavern began to evaporate like morning mist under the Texas sun. This wasn't just a performance, it was a revelation, a master craftsman demonstrating his art in its purest form. There ain't no way to hide that Amarillo skyline, like a brand new morning in her eyes. The lyrics took on new meaning in this context, sung by a man who had actually lived the experiences he was describing. This wasn't just a song about missing home. It was autobiography set to music, performed by someone who had literally traveled more highways than perhaps any performer in country music history. Dylan Carter's face had gone through several transformations during the performance, from smug anticipation to confusion to growing alarm. He might not have recognized the performer, but he couldn't deny the quality of the performance. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The old man was supposed to embarrass himself, not command the room like a seasoned professional. Behind the bar, Tommy Patterson found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, his Texas accent making the words sound like a prayer. "Do you know who that is?" But Dylan was beyond hearing anything other than the impossible reality unfolding before him. The old man he'd been systematically humiliating, the one he'd accused of being all hat and no cattle, was performing at a level that made Dylan's occasional karaoke attempts look like child's play. As George moved into the song's bridge, his fingers dancing across the frets with casual expertise that came from playing the piece thousands of times in front of millions of people, something else began to happen in the room. The younger patrons who had been filming the earlier confrontation were now recording for entirely different reasons, not to mock or ridicule, but to capture something they instinctively knew was special. When the only thing that looks good is the highway, going your way and mine, the crowd had grown completely silent now, every person in the room focused entirely on the man with the guitar. Even the background music from the sound system seemed to have faded into irrelevance, as if the entire universe had contracted to focus on this single moment. George's performance wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotionally authentic in a way that cut through all the pretense and attitude that had filled the room moments before. This was someone sharing a piece of his soul, using music to communicate something that words alone couldn't express. Near the back of the room, a young woman named Ashley Martinez, a junior at nearby West Texas A&M University, felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She'd heard this song hundreds of times on the radio, but had never truly listened to the words or understood their meaning until this moment. Hearing it performed by someone who clearly understood every nuance, every emotional beat, was like hearing it for the first time. At a table near the wall, Robert Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer who had moved to Amarillo from California for work, found himself completely mesmerized despite having no previous interest in country music. There was something universal in the performance that transcended genre boundaries, a sincerity and emotional depth that spoke to fundamental human experiences of longing, homecoming, and the search for belonging. But Tommy Patterson was the only one in the room who fully understood what was happening. He'd worked in bars and honky-tonks across Texas for more than 40 years, had seen countless performers come and go, had witnessed the rise and fall of musical trends and careers. He knew the difference between competent performance and true artistry, and he was watching a master at work. As George approached the song's climax, his voice soaring over the guitar accompaniment with the confidence of someone who had performed this piece in front of stadium crowds, Tommy finally found the courage to act on his certainty. "Dylan!" he called out, his voice cutting through the music just loudly enough to be heard. "You need to stop this, right now!" The young bartender turned toward his older colleague, annoyed at having his moment of reckoning interrupted. "What are you talking about, Tommy? Let him finish. I want to hear how this ends." But Tommy was already moving around the bar, his phone in his hand, scrolling through photos with fingers that shook with a combination of excitement and dread. He knew what was about to happen to Dylan's world, and despite the young man's cruelty, Tommy felt a flicker of sympathy for someone who was about to learn a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. George, meanwhile, was completely lost in the music, his connection to the song and the moment so complete that he seemed unaware of the drama unfolding around him. He was simply doing what he had always done, using music to create a bridge between his experience and the experiences of others, sharing something authentic and meaningful with anyone willing to listen. As the final notes of Amarillo Morning began to fade, the silence in the Dusty Boots Tavern was so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. They were all still processing what they had just witnessed. Then, the recognition began. As the last haunting notes of Amarillo Morning faded into the profound silence of the Dusty Boots Tavern, the atmosphere had been completely transformed. The hostile energy that Dylan Carter had so carefully cultivated throughout the evening was gone, replaced by something approaching reverence, mixed with growing awareness that something extraordinary had just occurred. George Strait set the guitar gently against his knee, his expression calm and humble, despite having just delivered a performance that had left the entire room speechless. His weathered hands rested naturally on the instrument, showing none of the tension or nervousness that might have been expected from someone who had just been publicly challenged to prove his worth. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of collective realization. People were looking at each other with expressions of confusion and dawning recognition, as if they were all trying to solve the same puzzle simultaneously. Dylan Carter stood behind the bar with his mouth slightly open, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The performance he had just witnessed bore no resemblance to what he had expected. This wasn't some community center amateur struggling through a few chords. This was professional-level artistry that belonged on concert stages, not dive bar challenges. That was actually pretty good, Dylan managed, though his voice had lost all its earlier venom and authority. The admission felt forced, as if he was trying to maintain some semblance of his previous control, while dealing with the undeniable evidence that he had badly, catastrophically misjudged the situation. Tommy Patterson could no longer contain himself. With hands that shook from a combination of excitement and disbelief, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through photographs, his breathing becoming more rapid with each swipe. When he found what he was looking for, a recent publicity photograph from George Strait's official website, he nearly dropped the device. The image showed George in his iconic pose, black cowboy hat, gentle smile, acoustic guitar cradled in his arms against a backdrop that could have been any stage in America. The resemblance to the man sitting quietly with the old guitar was unmistakable, though the bar's dim lighting and the passage of years had initially obscured the connection. "Dylan," Tommy said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through silk. "Do you have any idea who you've been talking to?" The young man turned toward his older colleague, irritation flickering across his features at having his moment of damage control interrupted. "What are you talking about, Tommy? It's just some old guy who can actually play guitar. So what? Lots of people can play guitar." But even as he said the words, Dylan could hear how hollow they sounded. What they had just witnessed wasn't just competent guitar playing, it was something far more significant, though he lacked the experience or knowledge to fully understand what. Tommy held up his phone, extending the screen toward Dylan with the urgency of someone delivering crucial information. The promotional photograph showed George Strait in all his professional glory, and the resemblance to the man with the guitar was now undeniable. Dylan glanced at the phone, then at George, then back at the phone. His face went through a series of rapid transformations, confusion giving way to recognition, recognition giving way to disbelief, and disbelief giving way to absolute soul-crushing horror. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the continued silence of the room. "No way. That's not possible." But Tommy was already moving around the bar, his phone extended toward other patrons, showing them the same photograph. The reaction spread through the room like wildfire, gasps of recognition, exclamations of disbelief, and the growing murmur of people realizing they had just witnessed something that would become a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. "Oh my God," breathed Ashley Martinez, the college student who had been moved to tears by the performance. "That's really him. That's actually George Strait." The name rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Even people who weren't country music fans knew the name, knew the significance. George Strait wasn't just any performer. He was royalty, a living legend who had helped define American music for more than 4 decades. Jennifer Walsh was the first to approach George directly, her nursing training helping her maintain composure, even as her mind reeled with the implications of what had just occurred. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, "but are you George Strait?" George looked up at her with the same gentle expression he'd maintained throughout the evening's ordeal, his eyes reflecting neither anger nor judgment, just the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to handle both adulation and cruelty with equal grace. "Yes, ma'am, I am," he replied simply, his voice carrying the same authentic warmth that had made him beloved by millions of fans across the world. The simple confirmation sent shockwaves through the crowd. People who had been casually observing the evening's entertainment suddenly realized they were in the presence of living legend. And they had just watched him being systematically humiliated by a teenager who clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. The implications began cascading through the room like dominoes falling in sequence. This wasn't just any elderly man who had been subjected to Dylan's cruelty. This was someone whose voice had provided the soundtrack to countless American lives, whose songs had been played at weddings, funerals, graduations, and every significant moment in between. Dylan Carter felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of his mistake began to sink in. He had just spent the last hour publicly mocking and humiliating one of the most beloved figures in American music. The king of country music had asked to use his bathroom, and Dylan had demanded he prove himself worthy by playing a song. The worst part was beginning to dawn on him. George Strait had responded to the challenge with nothing but grace and dignity, even while being subjected to treatment that would have been inappropriate for any human being, let alone a music icon whose contributions to American culture were immeasurable. Michael Rodriguez stepped forward, his construction worker's hands shaking slightly as he extended one toward George. "Mr. Strait," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and mortification, "I just want to say it's an honor to meet you. I've been listening to your music my whole life. My wife and I had our first dance to I Cross My Heart at our wedding 15 years ago." George stood and shook the man's hand warmly, the gesture natural and unforced despite the circumstances. "Thank you kindly, Michael. It's good to meet you too. I hope you and your wife are still dancing." The simple exchange highlighted just how wrong Dylan had been about everything. This wasn't some pretentious old man putting on airs or demanding special treatment. This was someone who treated a working-class construction foreman with the same respect and genuine interest he would show anyone else, regardless of their station in life. Robert Chen, the software engineer from California, found himself stepping forward despite his usual social awkwardness. "Mr. Strait, I just wanted to say thank you. I never really understood country music before tonight, but what you just did, that was incredible. That was real art." George's smile was warm and genuine. "I appreciate that, son. Music is supposed to bring people together, not drive them apart. Sometimes it just takes finding the right song at the right moment." Tommy Patterson had made his way around the bar and was now standing near George, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and mortification for what had transpired in his workplace. "Mr. Strait, I am so sorry about what happened here tonight. I recognized your voice the moment you started singing, but I couldn't believe it was really you. I should have stepped in sooner." "No need to apologize, Tommy," George replied, somehow having intuited the man's name from the earlier interactions. His ability to remember names and make personal connections was legendary in the music industry, just one of the qualities that had endeared him to fans and colleagues alike. "You weren't the one causing trouble." All eyes turned to Dylan, who was still standing behind the bar, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. The young man who had been so confident in his mockery just an hour earlier now faced a room full of people who had witnessed his spectacular misjudgment and cruelty. The weight of their collective attention was crushing. Dylan realized that his behavior would be remembered and discussed long after this night was over, that he had created a story that would follow him for years to come. Worse, he was beginning to understand that his actions reflected not just poor judgment, but a fundamental failure of character that went far beyond simple ignorance about country music. I didn't know, Dylan stammered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of conversations that had begun around the room. I mean, I don't really listen to country music, so I couldn't have known who you were. The excuse sounded pathetic, even to his own ears, and he could see in the faces around him that it was being received exactly as it deserved. The issue wasn't that he hadn't recognized George Strait. The issue was that he had treated another human being with such systematic cruelty and disrespect, based purely on assumptions about age, appearance, and cultural background. Ashley Martinez spoke up, her young voice carrying moral authority that transcended her years. It shouldn't matter who he is, she said firmly, her words cutting through Dylan's attempted justification. You had no right to treat anyone that way, famous or not. What you did was wrong, and it would have been wrong if he was just a regular person trying to use your bathroom. Her words hung in the air like an indictment, and Dylan realized that his shame went far deeper than simply having unknowingly humiliated a celebrity. He had revealed something ugly about his own character, something that had been shaped by privilege and entitlement into a casual cruelty toward people he deemed less important than himself. The room had begun to buzz with quiet conversations as people shared their disbelief about what they had witnessed. Several patrons were discreetly taking photos, though not for malicious purposes. They wanted to document their presence at something historic, a moment when they had seen greatness respond to pettiness with dignity and class. George, sensing the young man's distress and perhaps remembering his own youthful mistakes and the mentors who had helped him learn from them, made a decision that would define the rest of the evening. Instead of accepting the apologies and adulation of the crowd, instead of letting Dylan twist in the wind of his own making, George Strait chose a different path. "You know, Dylan," George said, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of 7 decades of lived experience, "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot tonight." The generosity of the statement, treating Dylan's systematic cruelty as merely getting off on the wrong foot, was not lost on anyone in the room. Here was a lesson in grace under pressure, in how a person of true character responds to mistreatment. The phrase was so charitable, so completely divorced from the reality of what had actually occurred, that it left several people shaking their heads in amazement. This was forgiveness in action, the kind of moral leadership that couldn't be taught in schools or learned from books. But George wasn't finished. What he was about to do next would transform this story from a simple tale of mistaken identity into something that would be talked about in Amarillo for years to come. A lesson in character that would ripple outward from this moment to influence countless other interactions and decisions. The king of country music was about to demonstrate why he had earned not just fame and fortune, but the respect and love of millions of people across the world. The lesson was about to begin. The Dusty Boots Tavern had fallen into an almost cathedral-like silence as George Strait stood before the crowd that had witnessed his humiliation, vindication, and the revelation of his identity. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see how this extraordinary evening would conclude. Dylan Carter remained behind the bar, his face a mask of shame and disbelief, while the other patrons watched with the fascination of people who instinctively knew they were witnessing something that would become a story told and retold for generations. George approached the bar slowly, his weathered boots marking time against the hardwood floor, like a metronome counting out the moments before a significant event. When he reached Dylan, he placed both hands on the polished surface and looked directly into the young man's eyes with the same steady gaze that had looked out from countless album covers and concert stages. "Son," George began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned hard lessons and grown from them, "I want you to know that I don't hold any ill will toward you for what happened here tonight." The statement hit the room like a thunderclap of unexpected grace. Dylan's eyes filled with tears. He was desperately trying to hold back, his carefully constructed facade of indifferent coolness finally cracking under the weight of genuine human kindness offered in response to his cruelty. "But Mr. Strait," Dylan's voice broke slightly, "I was horrible to you. I said things that I treated you like you didn't deserve basic human respect." "Like an old man who didn't matter," George finished gently, acknowledging what had occurred without anger or resentment. "I know. I was there." The simple acknowledgement of Dylan's behavior, delivered without hatred or the desire for revenge, somehow made the young man's shame more acute than any harsh words could have. This was forgiveness offered freely, without conditions or demands for penance. Tommy Patterson wiped his eyes with a bar towel, deeply moved by the grace he was witnessing. In 4 decades of working in bars and honky-tonks across Texas, he had seen the best and worst of human nature, but he had rarely seen someone respond to public humiliation with such dignity and wisdom. Jennifer Walsh found herself thinking about her grandfather again, imagining how he would have handled such a situation, and realizing she was seeing that same quality of character in action. This was leadership by example, moral instruction delivered not through lectures, but through demonstration. "You humiliated me tonight," George continued, his voice still gentle but now carrying an unmistakable weight of truth. "Not because of anything I did, but because of assumptions you made about who I was based on my age and appearance. You decided I was worthless before you ever gave me a chance to prove otherwise." The words were delivered without accusation, simply as statements of fact that needed to be acknowledged and understood. George wasn't trying to make Dylan feel worse. He was trying to make him understand the deeper implications of his actions. Dylan's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles white with the pressure. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Strait. I don't know what else to say. I don't know how to make this right." "Sorry is a good start," George acknowledged, his voice carrying the patience of a teacher who understood that real learning took time and couldn't be rushed. "But sorry without understanding doesn't mean much. Do you understand what happened here tonight?" The question wasn't rhetorical. George was genuinely waiting for an answer, and everyone in the room understood that Dylan's response would determine how this story ended and what lessons would be learned from this extraordinary encounter. Dylan took a shuddering breath, clearly struggling to find words that could adequately express his growing realization of what he had done and who he had become. The silence stretched out as he fought to articulate something that went far deeper than simple apology. I judged you without knowing anything about you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was cruel because I thought I could get away with it. I treated you like you didn't matter because I thought you were just some old man nobody would care about." The honesty was brutal and complete, stripping away all the pretense and attitude that had defined Dylan's public persona. He was confronting truths about his character that he had never been forced to examine before. "And why did you think that was acceptable?" George pressed, not harshly, but with the persistence of a teacher, ensuring his student truly grasped the lesson being offered. Dylan's response came out in a rush, as if the words had been building pressure inside him and finally found release. "Because I'm an entitled brat who's never had to face real consequences for anything. Because I've been so privileged that I thought I was better than other people. because I never learned to show respect to anyone, especially older people who have lived more life and learned more lessons than I ever have. The admission was so raw, so completely honest, that it surprised everyone in the room, including Dylan himself. He was confronting the ugly reality of who he had become, shaped by advantages he had never earned and protected from the kind of hardships that build character and empathy. George nodded slowly, his expression showing neither satisfaction nor judgment, just the quiet approval of someone who recognized genuine self-awareness when he heard it. That's a hard thing to admit about yourself, son, but it's the first step toward becoming a better person. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the same $20 bill he had offered earlier, the money Dylan had mocked him for providing. But instead of placing it on the bar as payment for services rendered, George extended it toward Dylan as if offering a handshake, a gesture of completion rather than mere transaction. "Now," George said with the first hint of gentle humor he'd shown all evening, "I still need to use that restroom, and I'm still willing to pay for the privilege, just like we originally agreed." Dylan stared at the money as if it were a live snake. Accepting it would complete a transaction that had begun with his cruelty and ended with George's generosity. It would make him complicit in his own humiliation while simultaneously accepting George's forgiveness and moving forward rather than remaining trapped in the cycle of shame and regret. The $20 bill represented something far more significant than its monetary value. It was an offer of redemption, a chance to complete what they had started and transform it into something resembling a fair exchange between two human beings. "Mr. Strait," Dylan said slowly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "I can't take your money, not after what I did to you. Please use the restroom, it's the least I can do." But George didn't withdraw the bill. Instead, he held it steady, his eyes meeting Dylan's with the kind of direct honesty that cut through all pretense and artifice. "Son, this isn't about the money," George explained, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to see beyond surface appearances to deeper truths. "This is about completing what we started. You set terms for me to use your restroom. I had to prove I could play music. I did that and more. Now you honor your part of the agreement." The logic was inescapable, but more than that, it was a lesson in dignity and follow-through. Even after being vindicated, even after having his identity revealed and his treatment exposed as cruel and unjust, George was insisting on maintaining the structure of the original arrangement. He was transforming what had begun as humiliation into something approaching a fair transaction between two people who had started as strangers and were ending as something closer to teacher and student. Dylan reached out with trembling fingers and accepted the $20 bill, the simple exchange carrying more weight than any contract or formal agreement ever could. "The restroom is just down that hallway," he said quietly, his voice filled with a respect that was genuine for the first time all evening. "And Mr. Strait, thank you. Thank you for what, son?" The question was asked gently, but George clearly wanted to hear Dylan's answer, wanted to ensure that the young man understood what had really happened here tonight. "For showing me who I could be instead of just punishing me for who I've been," Dylan replied, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him that he hadn't accessed in years, if ever. "For giving me a chance to learn from this instead of just destroying me for it." As George made his way toward the restroom, the crowd parted respectfully, everyone wanting to give him space while simultaneously hoping for just a moment of connection with the legend in their midst. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the hostile environment Dylan had cultivated into something approaching reverence, mixed with genuine human warmth. Conversations began quietly around the room, people sharing their disbelief about what they had witnessed and their amazement at George's response to such treatment. Ashley Martinez was telling her friends about how the performance had made her understand country music for the first time. Robert Chen was already planning to explore George Strait's catalogue, curious to learn more about the artist behind the extraordinary display of grace he had witnessed. When George returned from the restroom, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had finally attended to a basic human need that had been denied him for far too long, he found the room had settled into a comfortable buzz of conversation and reflection. Tommy Patterson had been making mental notes all evening, knowing he would be telling this story for the rest of his life, but also understanding that it was too precious and meaningful to be cheapened by casual retelling or social media exploitation. As George approached the door, Tommy called out to him, "Mr. Strait, will you come back sometime? I mean, when you're in the area again?" George paused at the door and looked back at the room full of people who had witnessed something extraordinary, a lesson in character, forgiveness, and the power of responding to cruelty with grace. His eyes swept across the faces that would remember this night for decades to come. "You know, Tommy," he said with a smile that carried genuine warmth, "I just might do that." This turned out to be a pretty interesting evening. As he reached for the door handle, Dylan's voice stopped him one final time. "Mr. Strait." The young man's voice carried across the room with new strength and purpose. "I'm going to be different now. I promise you that. Not just tonight, but from now on." George turned back one final time, studying Dylan's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people's hearts through their expressions. What he saw there seemed to satisfy him: genuine remorse, real understanding, and the beginning of what might become wisdom. "I believe you will be, Dylan," George said, his voice carrying the weight of blessing and expectation. "And when you slip up, because we all do, remember tonight. Remember that how we recover from our mistakes is just as important as avoiding them in the first place." With that, George Strait walked out of the Dusty Boots Tavern and into the Texas night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed. Not just a musical performance, but a masterclass in human dignity, forgiveness, and the transformative power of grace under pressure. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the days and weeks that followed, Dylan Carter would indeed become a different person. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Real change never is, but it was persistent and genuine. He began listening to country music, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity about the world he had so casually dismissed. He discovered depths and complexities he had never imagined. Stories of real people facing real challenges with courage and dignity. More importantly, he started treating every customer with the respect he should have shown George from the beginning, regardless of their age, appearance, or cultural background. He volunteered at the local senior center, seeking to understand the generation he had mocked, and found himself enriched by their stories and wisdom. He learned the names of the regular customers, asked about their families, and began to see each person who entered the Dusty Boots as an individual with their own story, rather than a stereotype to be dismissed or mocked. The change in his behavior gradually transformed the atmosphere of the entire establishment. Tommy Patterson never told the story to any reporters or posted it online, understanding instinctively that some experiences were too precious to be commoditized, too meaningful to be reduced to viral content. Instead, he shared it only with close friends and family, and only when the conversation naturally turned to topics of character, redemption, and the power of forgiveness to transform both giver and receiver. Jennifer Walsh went home that night and called her elderly parents, telling them she loved them and asking about their day with an attention and care that surprised them. She had been reminded that every older person deserved the respect that George Strait had quietly demanded through his dignity, and she began to see her patients at the hospital through new eyes. Michael Rodriguez began teaching his teenage sons about the importance of treating all people with respect, using the evening's events as a powerful lesson in character and consequences. The story became part of his family's oral tradition, a reminder that true strength is shown not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. Robert Chen discovered that country music spoke to universal human experiences in ways that transcended cultural boundaries. He began attending local concerts and festivals, finding community and connection in places he had never thought to look. Ashley Martinez changed her major from business to social work, inspired by what she had witnessed about the power of compassion and understanding to transform lives and situations that seemed hopeless. And in Amarillo, Texas, the Dusty Boots Tavern became quietly known as a place where something special had happened, where a music legend had shown a young man what it meant to respond to cruelty with grace, and where everyone present learned something important about the measure of a person's true worth. The story spread slowly through the community, not through social media or news reports, but through the kind of personal sharing that happens when people witness something that touches their souls. It became part of the local folklore, told and retold in barbershops and coffee shops, at church gatherings and family dinners. George Strait drove home that night with his bladder finally comfortable, but more importantly, with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation is not revenge or anger, but the demonstration of who you truly are when tested. He had turned a moment of potential bitterness into an opportunity for teaching, transformation, and healing. The king of country music had reminded everyone present that true royalty isn't about crowns, acclaim, or the ability to demand special treatment. It's about how you treat people when you have every right to treat them badly, how you respond when your character is tested by cruelty and ignorance, and how you choose to use moments of potential conflict as opportunities for grace and teaching. Years later, when Dylan Carter had grown into a man his younger self wouldn't have recognized, he would often reflect on that November evening and the lesson that had changed the trajectory of his entire life. He would tell his own children about the night he learned the difference between being powerful and being strong, between demanding respect and earning it, between using your position to tear others down and using it to lift them up. The Dusty Boots Tavern still stood on that stretch of highway outside Amarillo, though under new management that had gradually transformed it into a place that welcomed all kinds of music and all kinds of people. A small, discreet plaque near the old performance area simply read, "Music brings us together," a reminder of the lesson learned on one extraordinary evening when a legend showed a young man what it meant to respond to hatred with love, to cruelty with kindness, and to ignorance with patient teaching. And sometimes, on quiet Texas nights when the wind carried the scent of mesquite and the promise of distant rain, longtime residents would swear they could still hear the ghost of that performance echoing across the high plains. Not just the sound of a song perfectly sung, but the sound of grace in action, of character revealed under pressure, and of the moment when a king showed his kingdom what true nobility really meant. The story had become part of the fabric of the community, woven into the collective memory of what it meant to be Texan, to be human, and to be worthy of the respect we hope to receive from others. It was a reminder that every interaction is an opportunity to reveal our character, every challenge a chance to demonstrate our values, and every moment of conflict a possibility for transformation and healing. George Strait had given them all a gift that night, not just a perfect performance, but a perfect example of how to be human in a world that often rewarded the opposite. It was a lesson worth remembering, worth sharing, and worth living by, long after the last notes had faded into the Texas darkness. And perhaps that, more than any song he'd ever recorded or any award he'd ever won, was the most beautiful music George Strait had ever made. The sound of grace under fire, echoing through the years and inspiring countless others to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and love over hate. The legend lived on, not just in the recordings and the memories, but in the lives that had been touched and transformed by one extraordinary evening when the king of country music reminded everyone present that the greatest performance of all is simply being a decent human being, especially when no one expects you to be.